So, welcome. I'm Ariel Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad that you all are here with us this evening. Just a quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. So just a bit of Zoom protocol. I won't be visible during the talk, but I'll be here. So please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. If you have questions for Lucie, please just use the Q&A function. It helps me to keep track of them. You can do that at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I am so delighted to welcome our speaker for this evening. Lucie Levine is a writer, historian, and New York City tour guide. She founded the historical company Archive on Parade and has collaborated with the Gotham Center for New York City History, the Municipal Arts Society, the Historic Districts Council, the New York Public Library, the 92nd Street Y, and Landmarks West, and us at Village Preservation on tours, lectures, and events. She is also the public programs consultant at Friends of the Upper East Side Historic District and a contributing history writer at 6 Square Feet. Lucie, thank you so much for being here with us, and take us away.
Thank you so much, Ariel. It is such a joy to be here with you this evening to talk about the equality of the soul, the religious left in Greenwich Village. You know, when I proposed this event, this lecture to Ariel, I said to her, you know, there's so much discourse today on the role of the religious right and its growth in our nation. But what's so interesting, we don't talk as much about the role of the religious left in American politics, history, and culture, when indeed the religious left has had an enormous impact on virtually every progressive movement in American history from the 17th century, certainly through the 1960s, but you could argue up to the very present day. And so that's what this talk is geared toward speaking about, what I hope to really show and describe and discuss this evening, which is the deep roots of righteous goodness in this nation, right? Righteous do-gooding in the name of God and in the eyes of what is holy, which is equality, that we are all equal in the eyes of God, that all people are equal in terms of their souls. And this idea, this notion of equality and of sort of righteous descent, as I said, really goes back to the 17th century in this nation. And so while this talk is going to be centered entirely in Greenwich Village, I am going to have to bring you out of the village and into Brooklyn for just a moment, because I want to tell you about Lady Deborah Moody, the first woman to found a settlement in the New World. She was, and I quote, a dangerous woman. History is wild when you read the historical record because it just keeps repeating itself. Lady Deborah Moody in 1643 actually was described as a dangerous woman by the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony at that time, John Endicott. Okay, so whether it's Elizabeth Warren, whether it's Lady Deborah Moody, those Massachusetts women constantly persisting, right? Which she did. In 1643, she founds Gravesend, and she does so as a Quaker. And that's going to be one of the first sort of religious dissenting movements that we see in this nation. Perhaps you've heard of Anne Hutchinson, who I think is actually more famous than Lady Deborah Moody, also a Quaker. And so we'll see this notion of Quakerism and Quaker people moving through this lecture, because when it comes to abolition, when it comes to conscientious objection, when it comes to nuclear disarmament, we're going to see the role of Quakers over and over and over again. That being moved by conscience, which is a tenet of the Quaker faith, is going to really lead many Quaker believers into what was known as the religious left, which was the fight for social justice underscored by a righteous understanding of the gospel, right? That came from within. So Lady Deborah Moody, when she founds Gravesend, does so as a Quaker, and so is not only the first woman to found a settlement in the New World, but also actually the first person to establish a grid system in what would become New York City. So she actually anticipates New York's 1811 grid by more than a century, because again, she's working in the 1640s. Her charter for Gravesend was also the first document in New Netherland to grant self-rule to an individual settlement and to allow for democratic elections. Finally, it granted religious freedom within the settlement. And Moody made sure that Gravesend, which was already religiously pluralistic and politically democratic, would also be socially egalitarian. As one of the nation's earliest city planners, she anticipated New York's 1811 grid by more than 150 years and divided Gravesend into 4 quadrants. Each quadrant was subdivided into 10 house plots. The plots faced the street on the perimeter of each quadrant, and the center featured farmland that was held in common. So each plot holder received a 100-acre triangular parcel of plot land, and those plots were distributed equally, irrespective of the socioeconomic standing of each member of the town of Gravesend. So this was a socially egalitarian and religiously pluralistic place to live, again, as early as the 1640s. But 1643, the same year that the Dutch patented Gravesend, gave land in Brooklyn to Deborah Moody, the Council of New Amsterdam also began to grant land to manumitted slaves of the Dutch West India Company, who created the first free Black settlement in North America in what is now Greenwich Village and the Lower East Side. This image actually comes from Village Preservation's Black History and Social Justice map. So this is the work of Village Preservation. So thank you for this map. But you can see the plots that were originally granted to manumitted slaves of the Dutch West India Company. And this process of land grant continued between 1643 and 1662. The first person to obtain land in that grant was a Black woman by the name of Catalina Anthony, who was granted 8 acres in what is now the area east of the Bowery from Hester to Canal. She was granted that land July 13th, 1643. When the British took New Amsterdam in 1664, they stripped free Black people of property ownership and thus seized those land holdings. But Black people continued to build community. And from the mid-19th century to the early 1910s, Greenwich Village was actually home to New York City's largest Black community. And a pillar of that community was Catherine Ferguson, who was an educator and an abolitionist. She was born into slavery in Virginia in either 1774 or 1779, and died at her home in Greenwich Village at 74 Thompson Street in July of 1854. Now, not only was she an abolitionist, she was also a woman of faith, a religious woman. And she is credited with founding what is now considered to be New York City's very first Sunday school downtown at 51 Warren Street in 1793. Her Sunday school was integrated. She provided care and instruction to 48 orphan children, 28 of whom were Black and 20 of whom were white. All of the children had religious instruction at her Sunday school. Again, because we'll see as this lecture goes on that the relationship between abolitionism, between Black activism in almost every sphere, and the church was always very tightly knit. But when it comes to the death of Ferguson in 1854, we have still in Greenwich Village a continuation of Black activism. And that is in the person of Elizabeth Jennings Graham. About a week after Ferguson died in July of 1854, Elizabeth Jennings Graham, a 24-year-old Black school teacher who was on her way to the First Colored Congregational Church at 228 East 6th Street, where she played the organ, would actually become the person to integrate New York City streetcars, anticipating the pioneering work of Rosa Parks by nearly 100 years. Now, Elizabeth Jennings Graham refused to give up her seat on the Third Avenue streetcar. For Jennings, this was extremely dangerous. At the time, New York City streetcar drivers actually carried whips with them to help them keep Black people off of the cars. Jennings was forcibly removed from the Third Avenue Railway streetcar downtown at what is now Park Row, and she was injured by the driver and a policeman. The next day, a rally was held in the village at First Colored Congregational Church, where a letter from Jennings was read aloud. Her words were also publicized by Frederick Douglass. Her father, Thomas L. Jennings, an abolitionist and also one of the nation's first Black patent holders, hired a young Chester A. Arthur to represent his daughter in court. And she won that legal battle. Elizabeth Jennings Graham was awarded $247.50 in damages, and the Third Avenue Railway Company desegregated its services. The rest of the transit system was desegregated in 1865. Now, once again, it's no secret or it's no coincidence that Elizabeth Jennings Graham would have been on her way to church, that she would have played the organ at the First Colored Congregational, because churches really became a center of the abolitionist movement. This is Mother Zion AME, which once stood at 213 West 10th Street on the corner of West 10th and Bleecker. This was known as the Freedom Church. It was home to a stop on the Underground Railroad. And this church was not only deeply involved in the abolitionist movement, but also became deeply involved in the equal suffrage movement. So equal suffrage both for Black men and for Black and white women. This church counted amongst its worshipers the abolitionist suffragists Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Frederick Douglass, as well as Sarah Smith Garnett and her sister Susan Smith McKinney Stewart. Sarah Smith Garnett was not only the first Black female principal in what became the New York City public school system, but also she founded the first Black women's suffrage organization by and for Black women. Her sister, Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, was the first Black female physician in New York State. The relationship between God and abolition also moved the poets of Greenwich Village as early as the antebellum period. One was this person, Julia Ward Howe. Julia Ward Howe lived on the corner of Broadway and Bond Street from 1833 to 1839 and worked for the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. She wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was published in 1862 as a pro-union abolitionist song. Howe was a major figure in the religious left. She went on to become a co-leader of the American Women's Suffrage Association, a founder of the weekly Women's Journal, a founder and president of the Association of American Women, and ultimately the first woman to be elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She also founded what we now call Mother's Day, but did so not as a greeting card holiday, but actually as a pacifist day, as a day that would, she hoped, help end all kinds of strife and war. And that, again, that pacifist conviction came out of her religious conviction. When she made the case for a woman's right to vote, she did so from a biblical standpoint. She begins with the story of David and Goliath, right? Speaking of the fight and the plight of women searching for the ballot. But she's actually most famous, of course, for the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And it stands out for a number of reasons. One is that it was not only an abolitionist Civil War anthem, but also it became 100 years later an anthem of the Civil Rights Movement. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr. ended his last speech, given April 3rd, 1968, the day before he was assassinated, with the words, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord," which is, of course, the first line in Julia Ward Howe's The Battle Hymn of the Republic. So if the first line is, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord," the last line is, "Let us die to make men free while God is marching on," right? And the message of that song, the conviction of that march, that anthem, is that under the eyes of God, trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored, people are fighting a righteous war, a righteous cause for freedom. And when it comes to this notion of his truth is marching on, the truth that goes marching wherever people are marching for justice is that all people are equal in the eyes of God. This is an anthem about the equality of the soul, right? Which is why so many of the earliest abolitionists, women's rights pioneers, and social justice advocates down the years were members of the clergy or were deeply faithful. But when it came to the role of God in this abolitionist movement, not only do we have the church as a site of the Underground Railroad, not only do we have the truth of God, his truth is marching on, as a truth of universal equality, but we also have the invocation of God and the sin of slavery and the idea of retribution, of a divine retribution from the Lord and Creator, right, from God. And we see this from the Black poet, abolitionist, and women's rights advocate, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper would actually collect her first volume of poems at the age of 20, but her most well-regarded work, or her first very well-regarded work rather, was published when she was 29 in 1854. But the poem that I am going to read you is her 1871 poem Retribution, which again is about the retribution of God for the sin of slavery. Judgment slumbered. God in mercy stayed his strong avenging hand, sent them priests and sent them prophets, but they would not understand. Judgment lingered, men grown bolder, gloried in their shame and guilt, and the blood of God's poor children was as water freely spilt. Then arose a cry to heaven, deep and startling, sad and wild, sadder than the wail of Egypt, mourning for the firstborn child. For the sighing of the needy, God at length did bear his hand, and the footsteps of his judgment echoed through the guilty land. Oh, the terror, grief, and anguish, oh, the bitter, fearful strife, when the judgment of Jehovah pressed upon the nation's life, and the land did reel and tremble neath the terror of his frown, for its guilt lay heavy on it, pressing like an iron crown, as a warning to the nations, bathed in blood and swathed in fire, lay the once oppressing nations, smitten by God's fearful ire, right? And her point is that this is the retribution of God, that there will be a divine retribution for the sin of slavery. And she doesn't, even in this poem, have to tell you what the sin is, that everybody knows what the sin is when this is published, 1871, the sin of slavery. She doesn't even have to be heavy-handed in her work at all. She speaks of the guilty nation, and we know what that guilt is. Now, both Howe and Harper were very active in the early women's suffrage movement. So not only in the abolitionist movement, but also in the suffrage movement. And that's because the suffrage movement came out of the abolitionist movement, that there can be no women's suffrage movement without Black activism, without the abolitionist movement. In fact, after the Emancipation Proclamation, women's rights were seen as, quote, a new outlet in the cause of justice. And indeed, the first national women's suffrage organization in the nation was actually founded in a church, right? That when it comes to the cause of justice, this is a divine justice, right? That everybody is equal in the eyes of God, and that it's God's justice, it's his judgment, it's his ire, it's his love, it's his mercy that are going to bring equality. So both Howe and Harper were present here at the Church of the Puritans on Union Square at the founding of the nation's very first equal suffrage organization, and that was known as the American Equal Rights Association, the AERA, founded at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention, held May 10th, 1866, at the Church of the Puritans on Union Square. The American Equal Rights Association was founded to secure equal rights to all American citizens, especially the right of suffrage, irrespective of race, color, or sex. So this was an organization that was fighting for equal suffrage for both men and women, Black and white, all people equal in the eyes of God, all people equal in the body politic, right? Now, at this founding meeting of the AERA in this church, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, whom we just heard from, invokes the Bible again. She said, "You white women here speak of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man and every man's hand against me." Now, the biblical ramifications of universal suffrage and the women's movement in particular were articulated by Celia Burleigh, who was actually the first ordained female Unitarian pastor in the United States. And what's interesting is that Julia Ward Howe was actually present at Celia Burleigh's ordination. So you can see how sort of tightly knit this world of the religious left was. Celia Burleigh went on to become the first president of the Brooklyn Equal Suffrage Association and of the Brooklyn Women's Club. She was also one of the founding members of Sororis, which was founded in Manhattan and was the first women's professional organization in the nation. She said, "The object of the government should be securing to every human soul the right to make good on the faculties of itself." And she said in particular that suffrage was part of that goal because suffrage held, quote, "the promise that every woman should one day belong to herself, live her own life, think her own thoughts, and become a woman in a better sense than she had ever yet been." Because again, if she could have the vote, if she could have choice in occupation, if she could have the barriers to full participation in civic, religious, social life, political life taken down, if women could be truly equal to men in American society, right? They would have the right of every human soul to make good on the faculties of itself, that this was a movement not only for political equality, but again, for equality of the soul, that in the religious left, on the religious left, every movement for equality is undergirded by the fact that every soul is equal in the eyes of God. And what's interesting is that we see that stretch for equality in the eyes of God, even on a left that is a champion of the Soviet Union. When we get to the turn of the century and we get to radical politics in terms of a Soviet-style dictatorship of the proletariat, we still have labor activists in Greenwich Village speaking in terms of the soul. Now, this is Crystal Eastman, who is one of my favorite people of all time. Crystal Eastman was not only a villager, not only a graduate of NYU Law School. She graduated in 1907, actually second in her class, NYU Law. But she also was the first female commissioner in New York State. She sat on the Unemployment Commission, and her work for that commission, Work Accidents and the Law, led to the first workers' compensation legislation in the United States, which she helped write, which was passed in 1910. She was also a co-founder of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. She was a founder of the Women's Peace Party. She also helped write the original Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. But when she graduates from NYU Law School, she does so as a labor lawyer. And her activism as both a labor lawyer and as a passionate women's suffrage advocate is really interesting because she comes out of a religious tradition. Her mother was Anais Ford Eastman, who was one of the first female Unitarian ministers in the nation, right? So she comes out of a childhood, a situation in which she was nursed from the religious left, right? The idea of women in the pulpit already. Her mother was a preacher, but also she comes from the place of the soul. She outlines in 1920, after the 19th Amendment passes, she writes a landmark essay called Now We Can Begin. And her question is, what does it mean to be free, right? Now that we have the 19th Amendment, she says the passage of the 19th Amendment is a day to begin with, not a day to end with. Now that we have this modicum of political freedom, now we can begin to talk about real freedom. And what she calls real freedom is a situation in which a woman's soul can be free. She says, what the women's suffrage movement must do is create outward conditions in which a free woman's soul can be born and grow. And the outward conditions are not ecclesiastical conditions, right? They are practical, hard-headed, we live in American society, what can we do with it conditions. And she also is interesting because of her labor politics, which she says she calls herself a radical. And at that time, radical meant that she wanted to see a political revolution in the United States. She wanted to see a Soviet-style dictatorship of the proletariat, but she realized that, she said, were we to graduate into socialism tomorrow, the problem of women's freedom, the freedom of a woman's soul, would not be fixed, because if we don't live in a world that allows freedom to women, the outward conditions of freedom, then the freedom of her soul can never be. And so the idea of the outward conditions of freedom that she begins to outline are, one, freedom of occupational choice. That's the top of her program, that any area of industry that a woman should choose should be free to her. Two, we have a revolution in education so that both men and women can be educated in the worlds of business, in the worlds of finance, in the worlds of political science, in the worlds of any traditionally male sphere, but also that men can be trained in traditionally quote unquote women's work. She suggested that there be a universal course in what she called domestic science. And she said that any person who enjoyed it, any person who felt fulfilled by domestic science could feel free then to take it up as a trade. So for her, it was complete equality, right? It was not the idea that women were going to be made only equal to men, but also that men would be equal to women, that all people would be equal to one another, and that they could choose freely how they would then conduct their lives. And so when it came to choosing how one would conduct their lives, she said that her next bulleted prong, her 4-prong program, was freedom of choice when it came to family planning. So the ability to find birth control and all, she said, all information about its methods should be free and all laws restricting its methodology should be repealed. And she said too that birth control was as central to the women's movement as equal pay, because it allowed women then again to choose when it came to choosing a vocation. Was she going to choose motherhood as a vocation or not? And if she did, how long? And so the 4th prong of her program was then to treat the experience of motherhood not only as an act of service and an act of love, but also as what it is, which is a service to the state and therefore a profession, therefore an actual vocation that should be compensated by the state. And so she believed in what were then called motherhood endowments and are today referred to as child allowances, right? And are actually part of our civil discourse to this day, which is quite interesting. But these are the conditions. These are the outward conditions that she proposed in which she said a free woman's soul can be born and grow. And so what's interesting is that her religious conviction was grounded in these practical needs of society. So she says, if you want to nourish the soul, right? If all people are truly equal in the eyes of God, and if, as Celia Burleigh said, that every human soul should be free to make good on the faculties of itself, well, how can you nourish the soul? And so she, as a labor lawyer, she as a suffrage activist, she as a self-described radical, believes that how do you make the soul free? Birth control, right? How do you make the soul free? Motherhood endowments. How do you make the soul free? Universal education. You know, it's a very interesting outward in kind of look at the soul, that one doesn't need to get on one's knees and worship, right? To purify the soul, to make the soul free to grow. One needs to have the social, sexual, economic, political freedom to live equally in the world. And then with those freedoms, then we can have the freedom of the soul. But the goal itself is the freedom of the soul. And when it comes to freedom, I think one of the most famous villagers who is synonymous with freedom, of course, is Emma Goldman, right? The famous anarchist, labor activist, birth control activist. But she too spoke of the soul. And often people think of Emma Goldman as not having an interest, perhaps in matters of the soul, because she, as an anarchist, disavowed religion. But if we look at her writing, we can actually see the relationship between anarchy and her discussion of the soul. She wrote, "The history of progress is written in the blood of men and women who have dared to espouse an unpopular cause, as, for instance, the Black man's right to his body, or a woman's right to her soul." And when she talked about a woman's right to her soul, she meant And this is an essay in which she wrote, what is in anarchy for women? What can anarchism do for women? And what's interesting to me is that here she makes the distinction between organized religion and the following of one's own soul and the nourishing of one's own soul. And she says that if she falls in love, she will love without permission. And if she wants to leave, she will leave without permission, without regard to the rabbi or the state, right? So she sloughs off what had been the organized religion of her youth, which was Judaism, and the sort of organized politics of the United States, which she did not espouse because she was an anarchist. But when it came to an organizing principle or a leading principle, right, it was what anarchy could do for the soul. And she believed that anarchy stood, she said, for a beautiful ideal, for everybody's right to beautiful and radiant things, that the radiance of the soul is what shines through. And when it came to social organization through anarchy, it was that every person would be educated equally and to a degree that the state itself, the formal apparatus of the state, would not be necessary, and that as free and equal individuals, every person could choose alliances, friendships, love relationships, family relationships that were equally beneficial and equally valuable. If people were valued for their souls and as the radiance of their own souls, then one soul's radiance could find another's, right? That this is a very, while her conception is not religious, it is deeply, deeply spiritual, right? Her relationship to anarchy is deeply spiritual. And at the same time in Greenwich Village that there is this outpouring of labor activism, that you have the rise of socialist and anarchist doctrine, you also, in Greenwich Village at this time, have the founding of the NAACP, 1909. Sometimes, if you go to the Lower East Side, right, if you go to the Henry Street settlement, you will hear that the NAACP was founded at the Henry Street settlement, but the first public meeting of the NAACP was at Cooper Union in 1909, so in Greenwich Village. And one of the founders of the NAACP was W.E.B. Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. And in popular white academic discourse at that time, at the turn of the century, white supremacist ideology held that Black people did not have souls, right? And so when it came to civil rights, when it came to the founding of the NAACP, just the very notion that Black people not only had a right to their bodies, right, as Emma Goldman said, but that Black people were people in the full sense, right, that they had the right to make good on the faculties of their souls, the right of every soul to make good on the faculty of itself. And Black people, just like white people, had souls and thus had that same right. And so when it came to making this case for equality, W.E.B. Du Bois begins with the notion of the soul, that the equality of the soul is what undergirds not only the abolitionist movement, not only the women's movement, not only the workers' movement, but then really the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, right? If we have the founding of the NAACP on the basis of the soul. And what's interesting is that there were a number of clergy involved in this founding in Greenwich Village of the NAACP, one of whom was Rabbi Stephen Wise. Now, Rabbi Stephen Wise is a very interesting figure because he became the most famous and well-respected Jewish clergyman in the United States during his lifetime. And he founded something called the Free Synagogue, which was, he called, a pewless and dueless organization. So you didn't have to pay, you didn't have to pay dues. And what's interesting is that Rabbi Stephen Wise had actually been interviewed at Temple Emmanuel on Fifth Avenue and 65th Street to be a rabbi there. And Emmanuel was at that time, and is today, the most prestigious synagogue in the city, if not the nation. And the clergy there who were interviewing Rabbi Stephen Wise told him that the board of trustees at Emmanuel was actually going to read every single sermon that he gave before he gave it. And he said, well, if that's the case, then I cannot be a rabbi at this synagogue. I will not allow for the pulpit to be policed in this way, that I don't want any part in that. And what's so interesting, and we're going to talk about Rabbi Stephen Wise and his progressivism in just a moment, but I will tell you that he's actually not the only would-be rabbi at Emmanuel who went on to found a social justice organization. Felix Adler also, who founded the Society for Ethical Culture. Felix Adler was the son of the chief rabbi at Emmanuel, or the head rabbi, rather, at Emmanuel. And he was groomed for that position, that he would be also head rabbi at Emmanuel. And they asked him, do you believe in God? And Felix Adler said, yes, but not your God, right? And engraved at the Society for Ethical Culture is the quote, ground where people come to seek the highest is holy ground, right? So when people are looking for the best of themselves, for the best of their communities, for the best of their nation, finding their best selves in a progressive model, that is a holy experience, right? And so we have the notion of progressive activism as a holy righteous cause. And we see that both with Stephen Wise and with Felix Adler, both of whom refused to take a clergy position at Emmanuel. Okay, so again, this is Rabbi Stephen Wise. He founds the Free Synagogue, and the Free Synagogue does a number of very interesting things, which is that it's the first synagogue in the country to have a social outreach unit. So it's founded as a deeply progressive space. It's also very much indebted to, invested in free speech, because again, Rabbi Stephen Wise will not be censored in the pulpit at Emmanuel. It is also the first synagogue, and this is after Stephen Wise's death. So Stephen Wise dies in 1949, but in 1972, his synagogue, the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, is the first synagogue ever to have a female rabbi. So the first female rabbi is instituted there in 1972. And then it will also become, in 1973, the following year, the first synagogue in the city to have an on-site homeless shelter. So there is constantly this renewed interest in a social consciousness, in the role of social justice in this religious space. And what's interesting to me, this is not in Greenwich Village, this is 2700 Bronx Park East, but I show you this because the role of progressivism on the Jewish left, and particularly within the Jewish labor movement, actually physically reshaped the fabric of the city. 1920s, a series of labor cooperatives, and this was one, 2700 Bronx Park East, that were built under the auspices of Abraham Kazan, who was known as the father of cooperative housing in the United States. He built a number of cooperatives. He actually built over 100,000 units of cooperative housing in New York City alone. But in the 1920s, he was the president of the Amalgamated Bank, which was part of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. And the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union was the largest union in the nation at that time. And it was composed overwhelmingly of immigrant Jews in the needle trades. And those Jewish labor activists got together with the Amalgamated Bank and also with the Jewish Daily Forward, which was edited at that time by Abraham Kahan, not to be confused with Abraham Kazan, right, who's the father of cooperative housing. So we have two Abrahams here. And the Forward financed many of these labor cooperatives in the Bronx and on the Lower East Side. But the idea of this that comes out of the Jewish labor movement is the idea of not only truly a socialist utopia, there are actually hammers and sickles carved over the doors at 2700 Bronx Park East, but the notion of dignity in workers' housing that is really Abraham Kazan's legacy, which is the idea of dignified workers' housing, that you did not have to live in a tenement, that you did not have to live without light and without air and without green space, that you could have, that it was possible to have affordable and livable housing in the city of New York. And he, in a way, really pioneers that, and certainly pioneers it on the cooperative model. And so something like this is known as the coops. So co-op, coop, if you say it as one word. So this is known as the coops. And this was true again also on the Lower East Side. And also in other parts of the Bronx, like Co-op City, and even in Chelsea, Penn South. But these that were built in the 1920s were both self-consciously Jewish and self-consciously socialist, which is that the Coops, 27 Bronx Park East, actually had its own library, it's had its own generator, it had cooperative stores. The largest celebration on the cooperative lawn was actually the Mayday Parade, because there was such a passion for what was then the Soviet Union, right? That there was this orientation toward both Jewishness. Some of the labor cooperatives that were built were actually called the Shaolin Houses, as a reference to the Yiddish poet Shalom Aleichem, that it was going to be not only the way of preserving Yiddish culture, so whether that be through putting on plays, having lectures, but also preserving the rights and dignity of workers, right? And so you had actually a transformation of the physicality of the city, the streetscape itself, through the notion of not only a religious community, but also through the lens of the goals of radicalism and social justice. But when it comes to radicalism and social justice and a religious community, in the 1930s, we can come to Union Square. This is Dorothy Day. Now, Dorothy Day founded the Catholic Worker, but even before she did that, even before she converted to Catholicism, Dorothy Day was on the picket line, okay? Dorothy Day began as a member of the IWW. She was a Wobbly, and also she was a major advocate for women's suffrage. In fact, the the National Women's Party in 1917, or beginning in 1917, and then for 2 years thereafter until the passage of the 19th Amendment, or I guess 3 years thereafter, had a program or an organization called the Silent Sentinels, wherein 2,000 women would, throughout this period of years, picket the White House every single day, that would stand in front of the gates of the White House so that Woodrow Wilson could not go into work without seeing them, that Woodrow Wilson had to acknowledge women's suffrage pioneers and advocates. And what's interesting is that Dorothy Day was there. There's a very famous moment within the history of the Silent Sentinels, which is that one day in 1917, the women were taken, this was known as the Night of Terror. The women were taken to the Occoquan workhouse in Occoquan, Virginia, and they were put in jail there, and they were force-fed while in jail. And this was a really brutal, truly brutal sorry, I keep saying beautiful, but I keep trying to say brutal. Good Lord. This was a really brutal situation. And Dorothy Day was force-fed in prison as a silent sentinel. And that is actually before she converted to Catholicism and founded the Catholic Worker, which she'll do in 1933 in the depths of the Depression. And when she does, the Catholic Worker's first newspaper, that she was actually a journalist, as many of the women in the women's suffrage movement actually were. But the first issue of the Catholic Worker newspaper takes the preamble to the IWW Constitution, which says a society in which it is easier for people to be good is the best society to live in, and adds to it, Dorothy Day adds, when people are good, they are happy. So she is trying to create a society in which it is easier for people to be good, because when people are good, they are happy, right? And so it's this idea of personal fulfillment for working people in the depths of the Depression that is informed by the gospel, right? Now, the idea of the gospel and social justice as we move out of the Depression and into the 1940s, this brings us now to Bayard Rustin. So Bayard Rustin was not only an architect of the March on Washington in 1963, but also he was a Quaker. Now, do you remember how I spoke to you at the very beginning of this lecture about the role of Quakers in virtually every social justice movement in American history, from Lady Deborah Moody to the present? Well, Bayard Rustin was raised as a Quaker. His grandparents were Quakers. His mother was a Quaker. He himself was a faithful Quaker. And he took on the role of conscientious objector during the Second World War. And in his letter to the draft board, he spoke about how his faith, his Quaker faith, made him a conscientious objector. But he also spoke about the way that Jesus would see segregation. And he wrote in that letter in 1943, "Segregation, separation, according to Jesus, is the basis of continuous violence. It was such an observation which encouraged him to teach, quote, 'It has been said to you in the olden times that thou shalt not kill, but I say unto you, do not call a man a fool.' And he might have added, 'For if you do call him such, you automatically separate yourself from him and violence begins.'" Right? That's Bayard Rustin adding to what he thinks Jesus might have said. So Bayard Rustin is adding, if you do call him such, you automatically separate yourself from him and violence begins. That, right, separation, segregation is violence. This is Bayard Rustin in 1943. Segregation is the root of violence. That which separates man from his brother is evil and must be resisted, is what Bayard Rustin said. That which separates man from his brother is evil and must be resisted. And that came out of his Quaker faith and his faith in Christ. Now, Bayard Rustin, as I mentioned, was active both in the village and in the civil rights movement. He was also trained as a singer. He had a really beautiful voice, and he sang at Cafe Society, which was the first integrated nightclub in New York City and in the village. And Rustin later was an architect, as I mentioned, of the March on Washington. And when it comes to marching with King, we have the interesting role of an interfaith coalition around the civil rights movement. This is obviously King in the center, but to his left, the man with the beard, that is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was asked, when he was marching with King in Selma, he was asked, did you have time to pray? And what's interesting is you can see King and Heschel praying and marching in this moment, but Heschel was asked, did you have time to pray? And he said, I was praying with my feet. That marching, that justice is a form of prayer, right? Because what goes marching on, the truth that goes marching on wherever people are marching is that all people are equal in the eyes of God. And so if you are working towards equality, you are necessarily praying. And the role of prayer as we move into the 50s and the 60s in Greenwich Village takes on a number of sort of different formats, because we have the great Reverend Howard Moody, who becomes Reverend at Judson Church. This is, of course, Judson Church. And Reverend Moody believed that artists, that writers, that dancers even were, in a way, prophets, that they were that one could learn, that a religious person could learn a great deal from an artist, a writer, or a dancer, because they were interpreting God through movement, through art, through music, through theater. And so Judson Church, under his leadership, also became home to one of the first off-Broadway theaters in New York City, became home to the Judson Poet Theater, became home to avant-garde dance, became home to avant-garde art installations. But this was not just the sort of glory of God in the arts, that Howard Moody really saw egalitarianism as his mission, that he opened a ministry for prostitutes. He would give snacks to women who were walking the street. He would also give counsel if they asked for it. Before Roe v. Wade, he was part of an interfaith coalition of ministers and rabbis who created a network of abortion services for women throughout the country seeking abortions. And when abortion was made legal in New York State, he actually continued to do that work until the passage of Roe v. Wade, even for women who were not New Yorkers, who were looking for an abortion from around the nation. And when he did this, once again, this was illegal prior to 1973, but he did it openly. He actually spoke to the New York Times about it in 1967 to say, like, this is not a secret. I am openly and actively helping women to find abortions because that's the right thing to do. And for this, he was called the Radical Baptist. Howard Moody also opened the first drug treatment clinic in Greenwich Village at Judson. And to this day, Judson holds as its three tenets justice, art, and worship. So justice is still deeply ingrained in the work of Moody's church. Now, Howard Moody has a beautiful quote here, which he wrote, "For Christians, the truly obscene ought not to be slick paper nudity, nor the vulgarities of dirty old or young literati, nor even weirdo films showing orgies or male genitalia. What is obscene is that material, whether sexual or not, that has as its basic motivation and purpose the degradation, debasement, and dehumanization of persons. The dirtiest word in the English language is not fuck or shit in the mouth of a tragic shaman, but the N-word from the sneering lips of Bull Connor. Obscenity ought to be much closer to the biblical definition of blasphemy against God and man." So the idea that the N-word is blasphemy because it's against both God and man, right? Because if one is going to, as he says, degradation, debasement, and dehumanization of persons, right? If one is going to denigrate another, then one is actually blaspheming, because if all people are equal in the eyes of God, then to speak to somebody as if they are lesser or less than human, you are not only speaking against them, but speaking against all that is holy, right? And when it comes to social justice within the church of the synagogue, it's interesting too to note that Greenwich Village is home to a couple of pioneering congregations for the LGBT plus community. So, for example, this is CBST. This is Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which was founded as the gay synagogue, which moved to West Beth in 1976. And these are marchers marching in an AIDS awareness rally. And you can see Congregation Beit Simchat Torah is represented there. But this was billed itself and does still today as the gay synagogue, and is the largest LGBT synagogue in the country to this day. And then here I'm going to end at the Church of the Village, because this is a plaque that was placed by the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation at the Church of the Village. Now, in 1972, this church on West 13th Street was home to the first PFLAG meeting. So the first meeting of parents of gay youth who were coming together to support their gay, lesbian, trans, questioning, you name it, children. That the idea that support was not only for people who identified as LGBT, but everybody who loved them, and indeed everybody who believed in the equality of all people and the equality of the soul. And so when it comes to, even to this day, the idea of where and how are we going to find space, meeting space for progressive ideas, well, we find them within a space that believes in the equality of the soul. So whether it be a church, whether it be a synagogue, whether it be a Quaker meeting house, and indeed that has been true in this nation since at least the 17th century, and it's true to this day. So thank you so much. That's what I've got, and I would love to answer any questions. I will unshare my screen so we can chat. Oh, I can't see you because it's a webinar, but hello. Ariel, you're muted.
Thank you. Folks, if you have questions, this is a great time to put them in. Lucie, I love all of this so much, as you know. Also, just a very short, is it? Oh no. I'm just, I enjoyed your shout out to CBST as a former home of mine. Let's see. Our one question is someone saying that Jesus has been called the first socialist, which,
yeah,
we see this. Amazing. Dismiss. Okay, great. Well, I agree with all the folks in the chat who are saying how fascinating and wonderful this is. Oh, Kat is curious, what is the source of the poem?
Which poem? The Frances Ellen Watkins Harper poem? That poem is called Retribution. It was published 1871, but I found it in an article on JSTOR. Actually, this was such a wonderful article. It's a book chapter, but I found it in JSTOR, and it's comparing the poetry of Howe and Harper. So it takes as its subject matter both the Battle Hymn of the Republic and other poetry by Julia Ward Howe, and then contrasts it to the poetry of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. So what I can do is send that book chapter in PDF form to Ariel, and she can send it out to everybody.
Oh, that would be so wonderful. I always love to share follow-up resources with folks. Thanks for doing that. We have a question from Nikki who missed Rabbi Weiss's connection to the village.
So I put Rabbi Stephen Wise in because I wanted to. His congregation actually is on the Upper West Side, but I'll be honest with you that I didn't talk specifically about him in relation to the village because I couldn't find a connection, but I wanted to talk about Rabbi Stephen Wise, so I did.
Yes. Also, I'm wondering if that is one of the many synagogues and churches that on its way on its way north, spent some time in the village. There are a number of religious organizations that, you know, spent a few years in the village before they had their, you know, official current spaces uptown.
Fortunately, I snuck in Heschel also. I was like, I had been looking prior to this talk. I was like, how do I put in Heschel? Like, was Heschel in the village? And I couldn't find Heschel in the village. But do you know who first said that to me? The praying with our feet. The first person who told me about that, Ariel, was you.
Oh,
Did
that's
you know
so
that?
nice.
Yeah.
Which I learned about that at CBST, which was
So it all comes full
based,
circle.
based out of Westbeth. So yes,
There you go.
that is and yeah, I mean, it's definitely not just an Upper West Side story, Kat. I agree. I mean, I think that, you know, so much of the stories that we're telling in the village have so much importance in the other neighborhoods in New York City and around the world as these movements sort of take off. So I'm glad that you brought all of these folks in, and I just think it's so great and important. I'm so thankful to you for this. I'm so grateful to all of you who are here with us and who have stayed with us this evening. We will be sending out the recording, so please feel free to share it with folks, and I will send out resources from Lucie as well. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and we hope to see you soon.
Yes, thank you all so much. It was a joy as always. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
You too, Lucie. Take good care, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.